Philip Mantle is an international UFO researcher, broadcaster, lecturer, and has got a ton of books on the subject. Former director of investigations for the British UFO Research Association and a MUFON representative for England. And the new documentary is streaming now on Amazon and YouTube based on one of his books. It's called Pascagoula 73. I can't wait to start that right after this show. Philip, it's so nice to have you on.
Yeah, good morning. Nice to meet you.
So the Pascagoula abduction case has been called one of the most credible and well-documented UFO encounters in history. Can you walk us through? I'm sure most of us in Mississippi are familiar with the story, but for anybody who's not, walk us through what happened in Pascagoula in 73.
Yeah, it was October the 11th, the night. Charles Hickson, age 42, and his colleague Calvin Parker, been working in the shipyard during the day. But one thing both gentlemen really enjoyed was fishing. So on the way home, Charlie said to Calvin, "Fancy doing some fishing tonight, son?" So they made their way down to the Pascagoula River. Calvin was driving, found a place to park, sat on an old deserted pier, like most fishermen do, sat with their rods in there, nothing much happening. And then these blue lights came from behind them. And Calvin thought, oh, it's the police. We may be, trespassing. We're going to get arrested. So Charlie and Calvin stood up, turned around, and of course it wasn't the police. It was a large oval-shaped object with two lights on one end descending. An opening appeared. These three bulky humanoid creatures literally floated out of this thing. Two got a hold of Charlie, one got a hold of Calvin. They took them into this thing, both into different parts. They were given an examination. They said that this machine came out of the wall and seemed to go around them as if it was scanning them in some way. And then they were deposited, back out on the pier, totally bemused, frightened out of their wits. And eventually they telephoned the local law enforcement and made their way to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, where they were interrogated by Sheriff Fred Diamond and his colleagues. And they were sent home that night, and they thought that would be the end of it. Nobody would find out. The sheriff said, "I'm not going to tell anybody." But somehow the story was out the next day, and their lives were never the same again.
So what I find interesting about this, and you've been researching UFOs for a long time, so you may know of many other stories that involve multiple people, but most of the alien abduction stories that you hear about involve one person, and that's what makes it skeptical. These are more than one person that all share similar stories. Their stories haven't changed over the years, and for whatever reason, it seems like a more credible account of this encounter than most.
Absolutely. Most abduction cases are of one person. They tend to emerge months, weeks, years after the event. Here you have Charlie and Calvin on the telephone. First of all, they actually phoned Keesler Air Force Base, and they said, we don't deal with UFOs now, ring your local authorities. So they then phoned, the sheriff's department. So within a couple of hours, they're sat being interviewed. And one of those interviews, the one with Charlie Hickson, we actually have a copy of it. So we have his original interview taken within a couple of hours. And from that, we can tell down the years his story never changed. What is also fascinating is that both men were then placed in a room by themselves for 5 or 10 minutes. And then the deputy came back and took something out of the desk drawer. Charlie and Calvin had no idea what this was, of course. And unbeknownst to them, they'd been recorded secretly. And the sheriff and his deputies thought, we'll get them now. They'll be joking and laughing. Of course, when they played the tape back, they weren't joking and laughing. Calvin was literally crawling up the walls and was talking about what had happened to them. So that changed the minds of the sheriff and his colleagues. They now tended to believe them. And in fact, Sheriff Fred Diamond had his own sighting a couple of days later. So, that hasn't happened anywhere before. And of course, the next day, they were taken to the hospital for a checkup where they were fine, but they were also taken to Keesler Air Force Base, the place that had turned them down the night before. They were given them once over for radiation, which was clear, but the brass that were there said, "Why are you here, gents? Why do you come and tell us what happened, to you last night. And whilst that wasn't recorded on tape, they had a stenographer there who recorded it. And we have the complete transcript of that conversation they had at Keesler Air Force Base the very next day. Totally unique, no doubt about it.
So should we read anything into the fact that Keesler suddenly wanted to talk with them? Was it the men in black that called him into their office to
I think it was just curiosity.
That Keesler saw?
I think they were just curious because it was the sheriff who decided to take them to there. They didn't turn up of their own accord. They were given an escort by the sheriff, and I think that tended to lend some substance to these two men. And I think they were now curious. Well, we've got them here. We might as well hear what they have to say. And of course, the location where they were fishing that night, although it wasn't a great spot, it wasn't an out-of-the-way place. So there's a bridge going over the river either side of them. There's shipbuilding on the opposite side of the river. There's boats going up and down. And there's commercial and residential properties behind them. And what our investigation uncovered down the years, and is still doing so, is other witnesses in and around the area saw something very peculiar that same night.
Yeah. Maria Blair, and her account from across the river is a pretty major revelation in Pascagoula 73.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, Maria and her husband, Jerry, were on the other side of the river that night. Mr. Blair, Jerry, he worked offshore. They used to service the oil rigs. And his boat was there to take him, but his boss hadn't turned up. So they were sat in the car waiting for him to come. And Maria said this blue thing came down the river, stopped opposite us, seemed to hover around or maybe look for something. And she knew the area. She knew there's no helicopters over there. There's no landing strip. And then the next thing she said, there's this huge splash in the water next to us. I think these are her words, Scott. She says, out of the water came this grey man. And it stood right up to my face. And then it was gone again. She ran and threw her husband's belongings onto this little boat. Now, this was about 9 o'clock. And then she ran back to the car. And she said, when she got back to the car, it was about midnight. And she couldn't understand what had happened in between. Long story short, her husband, Jerry, about a year or so later, took seriously ill. And he made Maria telephone me. And he says, Mr. Mantle, I've been lying. I saw everything my wife saw and more. And Jerry went on to explain that they'd had their own close encounter that night. And sadly, he passed away some months later. About a year after he died, Maria went under regressive hypnosis, which we had filmed, and it was a professional hypnotherapist, and she relived the account again under hypnosis. And then in a further interview, she tells more about what she saw that night with Charlie and Calvin. She claims to have witnessed what happened to Charlie and Calvin on the other side of the river, as well as have her own encounter as well, of course.
Well, the description of the aliens in Pascagoula 73 is haunting. Is this description, if I get this right, bullet-shaped heads, carrot-like noses, mitten-shaped claws, that differs in some ways from other descriptions of, say, the Greys?
It differs from any other encounter anywhere in the world. Myself and others have looked in the literature and online. I mean, you name it, we've looked. And it was one of the things that always stuck in my mind is when I first read about this encounter back in the 1980s, is these bulky-looking creatures. Calvin called them the big uglies, because to him they were big and they were ugly, And they had a wrinkled skin, almost like elephant skin, they described it. Their legs didn't move. They didn't walk. They actually floated above the ground, about a foot, 18 inches over the ground. They never made a noise. There's no communication with them. And right from the very beginning, Scott, both Charlie and Calvin said these creatures moved in a robotic manner. So they thought these things are not flesh and blood. They may well be mechanical. But it was only their supposition, their guess, if you like.
So just a haunting story. I can't wait to get into the documentary Pascagoula 73, streaming now on Amazon and YouTube, and Philip's book, Philip Mantle. Can you stick around? I want to continue the conversation and maybe get into the congressional UFO hearings as well. Mornings with Richard Cross. Scott Sands, more with Philip Mantle next here on Super Talk Mississippi. We've talked to a lot of fun people this week, but this is by far my favorite segment of the week, filling in for Richard. Scott Sands, find me on X at Scott Sands Media, streaming everywhere, supertalk.fm. Philip Mantle is with us. His documentary is airing now on Amazon and YouTube, Pascagoula 73, based on one of his books. Is there anything in the documentary that you were able to cover that's not in your book about the Pascagoula UFO encounter?
What we were able to do is to provide visuals rather than, transcripts. For example, both Maria Blair and Calvin Parker both were under regressive hypnosis, which we had filmed. And those are all transcribed for the book. You can read it verbatim. But of course, in Pascagoula 73, you can actually see the film of their hypnosis. And what is interesting in Calvin's hypnosis, before anything starts, he's describing the river in front of him. There's a boat, there's the bridge. Right at the end, he said, "Oh, and there's two figures on the other side of the river." Is that two figures, Mr. and Mrs. Blair? Don't know. Very curious. But so you can see it for yourself, Scott, and reach your own conclusions, of course.
I am fascinated by these stories, and I'm very familiar with the Pascagoula abduction story. I mean, first of all, it's inspired movies and music and pop culture references. Do you get into that at all in Pascagoula 73 in the documentary? Do you get into the impact at all that the abduction story has had on society?
No, because that is continuing. I mean, even, the supergroup Fleetwood Mac in 1976 had a record called Hypnotize. That's partly based on what happened to Charlie and Kelvin. And around the 50th anniversary, back in 2023, not long after Kelvin sadly had passed, there were other people, locally recording songs about it. And when Calvin's book came out in 2018, it's called Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter. Two local gentlemen read it, and they're both musicians, and they wrote a song called Blackwater Blue Moon. And it's excellent. It's all, you can get it, you can see it on YouTube. There is now a movie being written about what happened that night, and it has the working title of Blackwater Blue Moon. So fingers crossed that gets the green light at some point.
I do love these stories. I've got to be honest with you, Philip. I'm open-minded but skeptical. As Fox Mulder said in X-Files, I want to believe. I just don't know that I do. It seems like, and Lance and I were talking about a Bigfoot story earlier, it seems like after all of these years, and now with the prevalence of, a cell phone, a smartphone in everybody's hand with video, that we would have more definitive evidence of alien visitors, of extraterrestrials that we don't have. And we hear stories about UFOs with the lights in the sky. If you've got the technology to travel across the solar system from another galaxy to our planet, I don't think you need headlights on your vehicle. So that's one of the reasons why I'm somewhat skeptical. When I talk to other UFO experts like Giorgio Tsoukalos and Nick Pope, they tell me, well, the evidence is all around us. You just have to learn how to interpret the ancient alien visitors. So how do you convince a skeptic, an open-minded skeptic like me, that this is a real story, that these guys just aren't crazy?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm fairly skeptical myself. Now, when you deal with Charlie and Calvin, originally it was just these two gentlemen. That was their story that erupted that night. But then, of course, down the years, there's been all these other individuals that have come forward. They've witnessed events in and around the area, and including the Blairs, according to a chap by the name of Mr. Lewis Lee, who was working in the shipyard right opposite that night. He saw something. And Mr. Rusty Anderson, who was driving over the bridge, he and his wife saw it that night. Another lady by the name of Pamela Wrigley-Eaves, about a mile down the road, putting her children to bed that night, she saw it. So you have independent eyewitnesses to these events. So it's not just what Charlie and Calvin say. And then
have been a number of other sightings in the Pascagoula area in the decades since '73 too that seem to back up some of these stories.
Yeah, and we even had just a few weeks after this, in the same stretch of river, an object under the water that was illuminated, seen by local fishermen. They reported it to the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard sent a boat out. They saw it, and they hit it with an oar, and it went clunk. And again, we have the full Coast Guard report, nothing redacted. Everything is in there, and they said it was unidentified. So, and then when you push this evidence together, Scott, it's then up to you to decide what happened to these gentlemen that night. The way I've described it, we had two ordinary guys who encountered the extraordinary. Whatever that extraordinary is,
telling their story.
Not at all. I mean, Calvin was traumatized pretty much for the rest of his life. Charlie, not so. He thought it was important, and he wanted to tell the world about it. This thing had happened, and this is important. He thought it was important. He wasn't sure why or how, just that people should be aware of this. And so that both gentlemen, reacted totally the opposite from each other in the years that passed. And it is absolutely fascinating. So you draw your own conclusions. It's like presenting your evidence in a court, rather than just your 12 jurors. We have Joe Public, and they can reach their own conclusions.
We're talking to Philip Mantle, UFO researcher, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, Pascagoula 73, the documentary now streaming on YouTube and Amazon. So it's interesting to me that you've got some unredacted reports from the Coast Guard. I talked with the Keesler people after their interview. What we're waiting for, and there's been one hearing on this so far in Congress, are these congressional UFO hearings. And the U.S. military has started to release some of this footage and declassify some information. Do you think the government's withholding what they know, and why would they not want us to know about life on other planets?
Well, it's a good question. I look upon the government as being pretty much like you and I, Scott. We don't investigate UFOs. We investigate sightings of UFOs. By the time I get there, or whoever, it's gone. You're just talking to a number of witnesses who are as mystified as anyone else. Yes, they have some film and photographs, but then civilian organizations have film and photographs. And it is the duty of our governments, both yours and mine, to keep secrets. And it's not always the information that they have that is the secret, Scott. It's how they've obtained that information. It's the intelligence gathering network that is the real secret. And I'll give you an example. Many years back, a friend of mine worked in a mill. They made textile. And in the UK, we have the Official Secrets Act. He said, I've signed that. And I said, no, you haven't. You make cloth, He says, no, I've signed it. Some of the cloth they made was used for military dress uniforms. So I said, is this some kind of super secret cloth, And he said, no, we use it for other things as well. But because it was used for the military, he had to sign the Official Secrets Act. But there was nothing secret about it at all. So we're assuming because things are withheld that they must be, they must have something. But that's not always necessary. So it's just the intelligence gathering network that is the big secret.
We've only got a couple of minutes here, but as you talk about those secrets that the government may be keeping, if you look back at Pascagoula in 1973, height of the Cold War, the proximity to Keesler Air Force Base and maybe some naval installations and naval exercises taking place, is it possible that this could have been advanced military technology? And isn't it likely that so many of these UFO sightings are likely advanced human technology that has been misidentified?
Yeah, well, why not? Why not? I mean, it was whatever happened at Pascagoula was certainly unique, and we shouldn't really rule anything out. I mean, Calvin, I became very good friends with Calvin. We were very close over the 5 years I knew him, and he toyed with all kinds of ideas. And in the end, he settled on the alien. There must be alien because I can't figure out anything else. And if we'd have said, look, Calvin, it was really this is what it was, albeit human technology, he would have been quite happy to have an explanation. But he didn't have one at the end of the day. And we've looked at all of the explanations, Scott. And it's an open case file. It really is. We have all this evidence and all this information and all these witnesses, but we don't have the conclusion to be able to prove what it may not have been.
I can't wait to watch the documentary Pascagoula 73 on Amazon and YouTube. I've known about this story my whole time on the coast and in Mississippi, and as a fan of these stories, I can't wait to hear the latest information and the latest perspective. Philip Mantle, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, Pascagoula 73 streaming now. Great to meet you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much, Scott. My pleasure.
Michelle Polino, Fox News Radio Entertainment correspondent, joins me next. And any new updates, there have been a couple of new developments in the saga of the Real Housewives of Mar-a-Lago between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes, too. Mornings with Richard Cross, Scott Sands here on SuperTalk Mississippi.